It began not with a storm, but with the memory of one, the low, growling voice of the earth itself muttering in anger. It started far beyond the horizon, a sound so deep it seemed to travel through the bones of the hive, rattling pipes and teeth alike. We thought it was thunder, though thunder had not touched the skies of Hive Pirithous in living memory. The smog above was too thick for rain, too poisoned for mercy. Still, the sound rolled closer with each passing hour, a constant drumbeat of unseen menace. By the time we realized it wasn't weather, the sky had already begun to change color. From the upper decks of the Administratum spires, I saw it first, a sick, living green crawling across the horizon like infection under skin. It wasn't natural light. It pulsed, shimmered, alive in a way that made the air hum with static. The Vox officers said it was a mirage, atmospheric distortion from reactor fires beyond the ridge. I believed them until the first impact shook the tower. The tremor came up through the floor and into my ribs. My desk jumped. My data slate fell. Then the lights went red. I had spent 32 standard years at that desk. Adept 4th class logistics accounting. A servant of order. My fingers were trained to make sense of numbers that never balanced, to twist shortages into compliance, to worship at the altar of precision. In tally faith, the catechism said. But when the ceiling cracked and the Vox began to scream, all those years of ritual meant nothing. I remember the taste of dust and ozone, the red emergency glow turning the air to blood. Someone shouted for everyone to stay at their posts, to serve until released. No one did. The second impact tore through the east wing. Plaster and bone fell together. I was thrown against the cogitator bank, the corner of the console splitting the skin along my temple. For a few seconds I could hear nothing but the high, shrill ringing of a dying machine spirit. Then came the voices, thousands of them, orders and prayers overlapping, until they were indistinguishable from panic. I stumbled through the smoke toward the transit corridor, my robes torn, one arm numb, clutching the cracked data slate like it could save me. The world had turned to vibration and heat. When I reached the viewport, the sky was no longer sky. It was fire, green fire. It spilled from the clouds in spirals, licking the spires of the hive as if tasting its prey. Below, the manufactorums burned, each explosion a new verse in an endless hymn of ruin. And beneath that sky, crawling toward us in endless formation, came the Orks. Not an army, an avalanche made of flesh, rust, and lunacy. The ground itself moved with them, the vibration of their war machines a physical force that pressed against the chest and forced the heart to match its rhythm. Their machines were patchwork horrors, stitched together from the corpses of our own tanks, our own faith. Gun barrels bent into shapes that made no sense, armor plates hammered into place by fists the size of my torso. They moved like beasts, coughing fire and laughter, always laughter. That was the sound that defined them, not the roar of engines or the crack of weapons, but laughter that rolled through the smog like an insult to the idea of silence. The Vox crackled again. Through the static came the voice of some distant officer, commanding faith, commanding calm. Hold your stations. The Emperor protects. But his voice broke on the last word. No one listened. Sergeant Konar, our section's overseer, was already on his knees, whispering Binharic fragments to a slate that no longer worked. Others were dragging bodies from the rubble, their faces blank with disbelief. I remember thinking absurdly that I would be disciplined for abandoning my desk. Then the third impact hit. The floor gave way. I fell through a cloud of sparks and screaming light into the levels below. When I came to, everything was dust. The air shimmered with heat. The sanctum of records, the place where generations had recorded the hive's devotion, was gone. The sacred ledgers burned in neat stacks, their pages curling like old prayers. I coughed, spat blood, and saw the distant glow of the hive's defense batteries coming alive for the first time in centuries. Their beams sliced the air, blue and white against the green, striking the descending shapes that filled the clouds. For a brief, terrible moment, hope flickered. Some of the Ork craft exploded mid-descent, spinning into fireballs that rained across the horizon. The sight drew a cheer from someone nearby, half mad, half prayer. But the cheer died when 10 more ships fell for everyone destroyed. The sky turned into a storm of metal. They weren't landing. They were crashing, deliberately, joyfully. Their dropcraft smashed through the outer spires, ripping open corridors of fire. I ran, not toward salvation, only away from noise. The stairwells were gone, replaced by twisted sheets of metal that led nowhere. Bodies clogged every corridor, civilians, clerks, guardsmen. The air smelled of oil and meat. Someone fired a las pistol into the crowd, trying to make space. I felt the heat of it graze my cheek and ducked instinctively. My data slate fell and was crushed under the stampede. The loss hurt more than my hand. When I finally broke free into the transit hall, the ceiling above was gone. The hive's upper layers had peeled away like skin, exposing us to the raw burning sky. The defense field shimmered overhead, a dome of pale energy that hummed like a dying lumen bulb. For an instant it held, then it didn't. The shield flickered once, twice, then vanished entirely. The wind that followed carried dust, ash, and a sound I will never forget. The collective roar of a million alien throats screaming the same wordless joy. The orcs hit like rain. They came down in metal coffins, each one a fusion of scrap and teeth. Some exploded on impact, showering the streets with fire and iron. Others cracked open to release shapes too massive to belong in confined space. I saw one land on a transit tram, flattening it into molten slag before standing up through the fire, laughing, its skin the same color as the sickness that had eaten the sky. Las fire danced across its chest like candlelight. It didn't notice. It swung a weapon, something between a hammer and a generator, and the world around it ceased to exist. I ran again. The corridors of the administratum became killing fields. Statues of saints crumbled into rubble. Vox speakers bled corrupted hymns, their mechanical choirs looping on broken phrases. Efficiency is devotion. Devotion is... The voice stuttered until it dissolved into static. Somewhere above, the tower's upper floors collapsed in a roar that felt like laughter. I stumbled into a side chamber, half blind from smoke, and found myself before the reliquary of St. Dovin the Quill. Her gilded statue had survived centuries of dust, her bronze eyes fixed eternally on the parchment in her lap. Now her face was melted, her quill bent into uselessness. I stared at her, waiting for some sign, some miracle. None came, only the sound of masonry collapsing behind me and the heavy rhythmic tread of something vast. The wall burst inward. A wave of heat and debris slammed me to the floor. Through the haze I saw it. A monster in rusted armor taller than any man, its eyes burning with manic glee. It carried a weapon made from the corpse of a sentinel walker, welded to a cannon. It saw me, it grinned. I froze. My hand found a shard of rebar, though I had no idea what I meant to do with it. The orc raised its weapon, but before it could fire, a shell from the upper batteries struck nearby. The explosion swallowed the corridor in light and thunder. When I woke, I was buried in dust, half deaf, half blind. The orc was gone, torn apart, or simply moved on. It didn't matter. The sound was still in my bones. I crawled until my hands bled, dragging myself through wreckage toward whatever direction seemed less aflame. The Vox still hissed, somewhere deep in the ruin, repeating the same message in an endless, broken loop. Maintain order. The Emperor sees your labor. Maintain, maintain. When I finally reached the open promenade, the hive was dying in full view. The defense towers burned, the manufactorums exploded one by one, and the streets had become rivers of molten metal and bodies. The green light turned everything into mockery. I looked up just in time to see another wave of orc drop craft blot out the stars. They fell laughing, engines howling, the sky itself joining in their madness. That was the moment something inside me broke, the illusion of control, of faith, of meaning. So I stopped running. I simply walked forward through the smoke, past the corpses, past the burning banners, until I found what was left of my office. My desk lay half buried in rubble. My chair was gone. My slate, miraculously intact, still glowed weakly. On its screen, frozen mid-sentence, was my last recorded report. Inventory complete. Supplies adequate for one standard cycle. All is well. I laughed then, quietly at first, then louder, until the sound merged with the thunder outside. And in that laughter, I realized the truth every Imperial clerk eventually learns but never writes down. Order is only ever borrowed, and the debt always comes due. When I awoke, the sky was no longer green. It was orange, burning and cruel. Fires danced on every horizon, eating what little structure remained. The air tasted of iron filings and smoke. Every breath stung like acid. I couldn't hear at first, just the dull pulse of blood in my skull. But when the ringing faded, I realized the thunder hadn't stopped. It was just closer now, heavier, more personal. The Waaagh had reached the hive. I pushed myself upright, feeling grit grind against the raw skin of my palms. The walls that had once framed the administratum's sacred offices were now blackened ribs of metal, twisting toward the sky. The ceiling had collapsed during the night, leaving only slanted beams dripping with condensation and molten slag. The fires outside reflected off the metallic debris, giving the illusion that the room itself was breathing. My data slate was gone, my name, my records, my purpose, all swallowed by the green tide. For the first time in my life, there were no orders to follow, no ledgers to balance, only survival. I wandered through the ruin, guided by instinct and memory. Each corridor I passed was a graveyard of paper and flesh, statues of the Emperor, once polished to gleaming perfection, now stared blankly through layers of soot. Their faces had melted into grotesque parodies of devotion. The Vox system still muttered in broken rhythm, half prayers, half mechanical screams. The Emperor sees your labor, your labor, your labor. The repetition gnawed at me until I wanted to tear my ears away. I found the first survivors in the upper scriptorium, a handful of adepts huddled beneath a collapsed gallery. They were pale, trembling, their eyes flicking toward the ceiling every few seconds as though expecting it to fall again. One of them, a woman whose face was smeared with ink and blood, looked up when I entered. "You have a weapon?" she asked. I shook my head. Her lips twitched into something resembling a smile. "Then you'll live longer than we will." They were feeding a broken cogitator, its screen flickering with ghostly light. The thing sparked with every keystroke, but they persisted, muttering prayers of maintenance. "The front line requires ration packs," one whispered, voice trembling. "Ammunition. Paperwork must continue." I wanted to tell them that the front no longer existed, that there was no one left to read their reports, but the words withered in my throat. There was comfort in their delusion, a fragile echo of structure in the face of oblivion. I left them to it. Outside, the corridors had turned feral. The bodies of guardsmen and adepts lay in tangled heaps, laser guns still clutched in dead hands. Their visors reflected the firelight like blind insect eyes. I passed an Arbeits officer, arguing with a junior over a Vox console. Route through the sub-spire relay. The younger man shouted, "It's gone." The officer snapped back, "Everything's gone." Then, without pause, he drew his sidearm and put it under his chin. The report echoed down the corridor like punctuation at the end of a sentence. The survivor beside him didn't flinch, just took the fallen man's data slate and walked away. The hive had lost its mind. Everywhere I turned, order was unraveling like cloth soaked in acid. Adepts tore pages from holy ledgers to use as bandages. Feonitorum clerks pried open supply crates with their bare hands, weeping as they stuffed ration bars into their robes. Even the enforcers, those black-armored icons of imperial discipline, had become wild-eyed ghosts. They shot civilians for breathing too loudly, for moving too quickly, for not praying fast enough. The thin line between obedience and madness had snapped, and no one had noticed. At one junction, I came across a group of guardsmen herding civilians into a maintenance shaft. Among them was a man clutching a child-sized bundle wrapped in parchment bearing the imperial seal. The guardsman tried to take it from him. "She's registered," the man screamed. "She's in the census." The shot that followed was almost merciful. The body and its bundle fell together. The guardsmen didn't even slow their pace. By the time I reached the sub-archive vaults, the hive's lumen arrays had failed completely. The world had become red twilight punctuated by muzzle flashes and fire. The archives were ancient, a place I had always imagined untouchable. Massive halls of paper records sealed behind adamantine doors. But even here war had found a way in. I stepped into the vast chamber and was met by silence. Row upon row of shelves stretched upward into blackness, filled with the relics of human order. For the first time since the bombardment began, I felt something close to peace. The smell of old parchment and ink dulled the stench of blood. I lit a lumen stick and wandered between the shelves, running my fingers along the spines of ledgers. Tithe reports Sector Delta 9, Agricultural Yield Revisions Year 703, M41. Each title was a prayer to structure, a fossilized promise that humanity once believed in logic. I sank to my knees, the weight of exhaustion pressing down, and began to read at random. The words meant nothing now, but their rhythm soothed me. Columns of numbers, stamped seals, signatures, all fragments of a vanished god. Then I heard footsteps. Not boots, bare feet, wet and slow. I extinguished my lumen stick and crouched low behind a stack of ledgers. The sound drew closer, irregular, accompanied by the soft hiss of breath. Through the shadows a figure emerged, an adept, or what was left of one. His robes were torn and blackened. His face was a mask of ink and ash. He carried a flamer in shaking hands, the muzzle dripping fuel. "Who's there?" I whispered before I could stop myself. He didn't answer. He turned toward the shelves, his movements reverent, almost priestly. "The data is impure," he murmured. Then he pulled the trigger. The roar of fire consumed the silence. Pages ignited in an instant, the flames leaping like eager children. I screamed at him to stop, but he was already walking deeper into the inferno, chanting over the sound of burning parchment. "The Emperor demands purity. The Emperor demands cleansing." The ceiling groaned, then gave way, burying him in a torrent of ashen flame. I fled, my robes catching fire at the hem, my lungs filling with smoke. When I reached the stairwell, I looked back. The archives were gone. Centuries of knowledge turned to light and ruin. The smell of burning paper was almost sweet. I realized then that this was what faith truly was, the act of destroying everything you don't understand to keep your illusions intact. The vox crackled as I climbed, spitting out the voice of a sector overseer. "All adepts are to report to their designated emergency stations. Data preservation is paramount. The Emperor protects." The message repeated twice before dissolving into static. When I emerged into the upper halls again, there were no stations left. The offices had become triage centers, desks replaced with corpses. Banners of the administratum hung in tatters, soaked in blood. At the far end of the corridor, an Arbeits enforcer stood atop a mound of bodies. His armor was cracked, his shotgun still smoking. "Hold the line!" he screamed to no one. "By decree of the Lex Imperialis, hold." His voice cracked, then shifted into laughter, hollow and manic. That was when I heard the first orc inside the precinct. It was a sound like tearing metal mixed with glee. The Arbeit turned, fired once into the dark. The muzzle flash lit the corridor just long enough for me to see it, a green giant grinning with a mouthful of knives. The shot vaporized part of its shoulder. It didn't care. It tore him in half with one hand. Panic swallowed everything. The wounded tried to crawl, the medics dropped their tools, the prayers turned to screams. I ran without thinking, diving through a curtain of cables as the orc roared. The wall behind me exploded in a shower of concrete and bone. I fell through a maintenance hatch just as the floor gave way, crashing into the level below. When I awoke, the orc was gone, buried or bored. My ears rang with the echo of collapse. The vox still whispered its broken hymns. The hive still burned above me, and somewhere beyond the smoke, laughter continued to ripple through the ruins. I stood on shaking legs and looked around. The data slate, the one I thought destroyed, was somehow still there, its cracked screen glowing faintly. I picked it up, hands trembling, and began to type. Not because it mattered, because I didn't know what else to do. Status report. Administratum precinct destroyed. Authority dissolved. Faith unquantifiable. Emperor's light insufficient. The words flickered across the screen, pathetic, meaningless. But I couldn't stop. Documentation was all I had left. The act itself was prayer. When the power cell died, I stared at the dark screen and listened. Above, the green laughter rose again, echoing through the hive's broken lungs. It didn't fade. It didn't rest. It was eternal. That was when I understood the truth the Imperium never writes down. The Orks don't invade, they arrive. And once they're here, they never really leave. The Manufactorum called to us like a dying god. Not in words, but in sound, deep, rhythmic, metallic. The voice of industry refusing to fall silent, even as the hive crumbled around it. By the time I reached its gates, the upper spires were gone. The air choked with black smoke that tasted of ash and blood. The Orks had turned the skyline into their own cathedral, and every flame was a hymn. Yet still the Manufactorum breathed. Its furnaces glowed beneath the rubble, its chimneys exhaling the last prayers of the machine god into a sky that no longer listened. The great gate of Manufactorum 17 to Omicron was half open, the steel teeth bent and twisted. I slipped through the gap with a handful of survivors, guardsmen without rifles, adepts without data slates, civilians with eyes so wide they looked hollow. None of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. Inside, the heat pressed down like judgment. The machinery was alive but wrong. Piston canticles were out of rhythm, servo hymns stuttered and looped. The sacred patterns of labor had been corrupted into noise. I could almost hear the laughter of the green horde woven into it. We found shelter in the assembly pit, near the central reactor. The air there shimmered with heat and ghosts. The floor pulsed faintly underfoot, as though remembering the millions of steps that had walked its surface in ages past. The survivors gathered in a loose circle. Someone produced a ration pack. Another tore it open with teeth, offering the contents without looking up. The paste tasted like metal and despair. No one complained. Even hunger had become ritual. A tech priest was among us, though barely. His robes were burned to rags, the once holy red stained black with soot. His servo arm hung limply, leaking oil that smoked where it hit the floor. Half his face was steel, the other half bone and blister. He whispered Binharic fragments to himself, fingers brushing the walls with reverence. When he noticed me watching, his augmetic eye flickered. "The machine remembers," he said, voice like static. "It remembers the hands that built it. It remembers the faith that woke it." He laid his palm against the metal, sighing. "We will be safe here." I wanted to ask him how, but the question died on my tongue. He had already turned away, speaking softly to the humming floor. Faith had not left him. It had merely changed its shape. I envied him. The Manufactorum groaned around us like a creature in its sleep. I walked among the silent forges, the assembly lines littered with the corpses of servitors that had simply burned out mid-function. Their flesh had melted into their machines, their final prayers still etched into their lips. Fire is faith, faith is function. Their eyes were open but empty, reflecting the flicker of dying furnaces. I touched one's metal arm and felt warmth still there. By the second day, the noise outside had begun to fade, but only because it had moved closer. The Orks had reached the Manufactorum district. Their engines roared like beasts, their laughter blending with the machinery's dying breath. Every few minutes the walls shuddered with a distant impact. Each tremor drew closer. The survivors flinched less each time. Fear had become background noise. The tech priest murmured blessings to the reactor core, coaxing the machine spirit like a priest soothing a fevered child. He told us the heat signature would hide us from Ork scanners. We nodded because belief was easier than doubt. That night, or what passed for night beneath the smoke, the Manufactorum awoke. At first it was subtle, a slow rhythmic clicking. Then the conveyors began to move, dragging rusted components through the dark. Cranes twitched to life, their cables swaying like limbs remembering how to move. Sparks rained down from the rafters as dormant assembly arms reached for nothing. The air filled with the groan of 1,000 gears turning out of sync. The Manufactorum was alive again, but it wasn't building anything. It was remembering. Some of the survivors began to pray. Others wept. The tech priest only smiled, a thin, cracked expression that stretched across the metal side of his face. "The machine has not forgotten," he whispered. "It still serves." I wanted to believe that. I really did, but there was something wrong in the sound. It was too human. The creak of pistons, the hiss of steam, it all began to resemble breathing. Then came the explosion. The wall to the east buckled inward, molten steel splintering into dust. The shockwave hit like a fist. I fell to the ground, ears ringing, vision flashing white. Through the smoke and flame came the laughter, the same laughter that had haunted the sky. The orcs were inside. Their arrival wasn't stealthy or tactical. It was joyous. They came crashing through the breach in a storm of smoke and bullets, firing wildly, their guttural voices shaking the walls. One of them swung a weapon that looked like a cannon strapped to a power drill, each shot tearing chunks of the manufactorum into shrapnel. The tech priest stood tall by the reactor, his broken servo arm raised like a banner. "Protect the machine!" he shouted, his voice half binary, half prayer. "By the Omnissiah's grace, protect the sacred core." He didn't wait for us to obey. He charged. He met the first orc head-on, striking its armor with his staff. The blow sparked harmlessly, but the orc staggered, surprised that anything so small dared resist. Then it laughed, a sound so deep it vibrated the air and backhanded him across the room. He hit the reactor's casing and fell, leaving a smear of oil and blood. But even dying, he reached for the damage, whispering Binharic code into the wound. The reactor flared in response, a brief, blinding pulse of white. The orc screamed, molten light pouring through the cracks in its crude armor. Then the world erupted. The reactor vented its fury in a single burst. The explosion swallowed half the chamber, vaporizing everything within reach. When I opened my eyes, the air shimmered with heat. The orcs were gone, or parts of them were. The walls dripped metal. The tech priest was gone too, reduced to ash and circuit fragments. Only his staff remained, half melted into the floor. We ran. I didn't think. I just moved, crawling through the smoke and debris toward the lower conduits. The manufactorum was collapsing, screaming as it died. The pipes overhead burst in succession, raining oil and steam. Conveyor belts twisted into knots. The air became unbreathable, thick with ash and vaporized bone. Somewhere behind me, someone screamed for help, but I didn't turn back. The machine's voice had become a howl of agony, and I knew that staying meant becoming part of it. I found a maintenance shaft half collapsed, its entrance framed by jagged steel. Inside, a handful of survivors crouched in the dark, a medic, 2 guardsmen, and a servitor missing half its face. They looked at me like a ghost. "Where are the others?" one of the guardsmen asked. His voice was shaking, not from fear but from exhaustion. "Gone?" I said. "The orcs, the reactor, all gone." He nodded, almost relieved. Then he sat down and began to cry quietly. The medic was the only one who still had purpose. She knelt beside the servitor, whose exposed chest cavity sparked faintly. "Serial 602 Beta," she whispered, her tone gentle. "Logged as deceased. Cause of death, continuation." I didn't understand at first. Then she touched its cold metal face. "They keep working," she said, "even when there's nothing left to work for." Outside, the orcs roared again, the sound shaking the floor. They were dismantling the manufactorum, turning it into their own playground. Through the vents, we saw the glow of their torches, the silhouettes of their shapes moving among the ruins. They were tearing cranes apart, welding them into new shapes, mockeries of themselves. They weren't conquering. They were creating. We stayed hidden for hours, maybe days. Time had no meaning in that place. The medic died first, her lungs collapsing under the fumes. The guardsman went next, vanishing into the tunnels in search of escape. I never saw them again. I sat alone beside the silent servitor and opened my data slate one last time. Its power cell blinked weakly, its light dim but steady. I began to type, each keystroke a heartbeat. The manufactorum breathes still, the dead serve. The machine remembers. The orcs have left, but the walls whisper. The Omnissiah is not silent. He is listening. The words blurred before my eyes. I think I slept. When I woke, the manufactorum was silent. Truly silent. The hum of gears, the groan of pistons, even the echo of my own breath had stopped. The air was still and warm, as though the machine had died in peace. I reached out and laid my hand on the floor. The metal was warm. I whispered a prayer I no longer believed in, and for a moment I thought I heard it whisper back. There was no day or night anymore, only the breathing of the fires. The orcs had turned war into weather, storms of sound and metal rolling endlessly through the hive's carcass. The manufactorum behind me had fallen silent at last, its final breath still echoing in the heat. I wandered without direction, crawling through wreckage, dragging my body forward because stopping meant listening, and listening meant remembering. The hive was unrecognizable. The avenues of marble and steel had become veins of molten slag. Entire hab blocks leaned into one another, like corpses that refused to lie down. Vox poles sparked in the ruins, sending fragments of old prayers into the air. Each one ended in laughter, not human laughter, but that booming, throaty joy the orcs carried like contagion. Even in death, their echoes filled the smog. Their corpses still grinned. I learned to move like vermin, to breathe shallow, to sleep only when the bombardment grew near enough to mask my heartbeat. I scavenged where I could. Ration paste hardened into brick, water pooled in the hollows of dead machinery. The taste of iron never left my tongue. Hunger became ritual, thirst became prayer. I stopped marking time. Only the rhythm of artillery told me the difference between hours and eternity. Once deep beneath a collapsed transit line, I found a tunnel lit by a faint blue glow. Fungal growths clung to the walls, pulsing gently like dying lumen globes. I followed their light downward, until I reached a cavern where bodies hung from chains, scores of them stripped and drained. The air dripped with blood that glowed faintly in the fungus light. Words had been scrawled across the walls in that same blood-jagged, looping shapes that hurt to look at. I turned away, but the shape stayed with me, branded into the inside of my eyelids. When I returned to the upper hive, I realized I had no idea how long I'd been below. The fires had changed color again, green to gold to the dull orange of rust. The skyline was gone, replaced by the orcs' mockery of architecture. Towers of scrap, welded idols, skulls of engines stacked into pyramids. The city had become a living shrine to chaos and noise. I remember thinking how alive it all seemed, how joyful in its destruction. Humanity kills out of duty, the orcs kill out of love. In the hollow of a ruined hab block I found survivors, 5 in total, 2 guardsmen, a pair of hab workers and a child who didn't speak. Their shelter was a collapsed stairwell draped in plastile sheets. Inside it was dark, damp and silent. They let me in because I looked like them, hollow, grey, nameless. The air smelled of sweat and old fear. No one spoke unless necessary. Words felt too expensive. The elder guardsman's leg had gone black from infection. He kept a las pistol in his lap and pointed it at anyone who lingered too long. His younger comrade muttered the same phrase over and over, a broken catechism. The guns are still firing. The Emperor protects. The hab workers stared upward as if waiting for a roof that would never return. The child slept curled in a corner, sometimes laughing softly, though there was nothing left to laugh at. We lasted 4 days. On the 5th, the sky split open again. The bombardment hit closer than before, each impact a hammer blow that made the ground buck beneath us. The ceiling cracked, pouring dust and light. The older guardsman tried to stand, his ruined leg folding beneath him. The younger panicked. He screamed, firing upward at nothing, the muzzle flash blinding in the dark. His shot took the older man through the chest. For a second, no one moved. Then the others tore the weapon from his hands, and he put the barrel under his chin before they could stop him. We left that place before the orcs found it. The hab workers went one way. The child disappeared into the smoke. I didn't follow. I moved alone through the streets that had once been arteries of empire, now clotted with bodies. I passed a broken cathedral, where a servo skull drifted in slow circles above a pool of melted glass. Its vox emitter still worked, repeating a prayer in a voice cracked with static. Labor is devotion. Devotion is eternity. I bowed my head without knowing why. Later, in the shell of a plaza, I found a single servitor sweeping ash into neat piles. Its augmetic limbs creaked with every motion, its flesh grey with soot. It didn't react to me, just kept working, sweeping the same patch of floor again and again. I watched it until my legs gave out. When I asked why it continued, its vox hissed but no words came. I think I envied it. Purpose, even meaningless purpose, was still a kind of faith. Days, or what passed for them, bled together. The city was a wound that refused to close. I walked past a guardsman pinned beneath a wall, his lower body gone. His armor gleamed as if newly polished. He smiled when he saw me. "They can't win," he said. "We'll drown them in our blood first." He asked me to hand him his pistol. I did. I walked away before he pulled the trigger. The sound of it was swallowed by the thunder. Eventually, I reached the central transit hub. Once it had been a monument to Imperial engineering, a dome of gold and glass that stretched higher than any mountain. Now it was a cracked skull, half buried in rubble. The rails twisted like veins, the walls scorched black, and in the center of it all stood a statue of the Emperor, still upright, though cracked from crown to base. His face, once raised toward the heavens, now looked directly at the ground as if ashamed. I sat at his feet and tried to pray. The words came broken, incomplete. "Emperor, preserve us, Emperor. Protect." The echo that answered wasn't divine, it was laughter. The same laughter that had haunted the air since the first shell fell. It rolled through the dome, deep and endless, shaking the statue until its cracked hand broke off and fell at my feet. Through the shattered ceiling, I saw their aircraft circling above, black silhouettes against the burning green. They weren't fighting anymore. They were celebrating. The Waaagh was victory itself, the end of purpose, the triumph of noise. I ran again, through corridors slick with blood, through chambers where icons of faith melted like wax. The roar followed me, louder with every step. I found an alley filled with corpses, all facing the same way as if frozen mid-flight. Their eyes were open, their mouths twisted in silent screams. For a heartbeat the air was still, and I thought the world had ended. Then the laughter came again, distant but eternal. I sat down among the dead and closed my eyes. The roar was everywhere, outside, inside, in my blood. It wasn't rage or victory. It was existence itself. The orcs didn't fight for conquest or creed. They fought to prove they were alive. And the Imperium, for all its prayers, fought only to avoid being forgotten. Somewhere between those two truths, humanity was crushed. When I opened my eyes again, the fires still burned, and I was still breathing. The Waaagh hadn't killed me. It had made me part of its rhythm. I realized then that survival wasn't mercy. It was continuation. And in that endless noise, continuation was the cruelest fate of all. They say the Emperor's mercy is endless, but mercy is just another word for delay. When the roar finally faded and the smoke began to settle, I thought it might mean peace. I was wrong. The silence that followed the Waaagh was heavier than any bombardment. It filled every space like ash, clinging to the lungs until breathing felt like defiance. Hive Pirithous didn't die quickly. It decayed, collapsing by inches, its bones creaking in the wind. The green light was gone from the sky, but its ghost lingered, a faint, sickly hue woven into every dawn. I don't know how long I wandered. Days, weeks? There were no clocks anymore, no shifts, no bells. Only the slow rhythm of survival. Scavenge, rest, move, repeat. The orcs had moved on, chasing the scent of war to another world, another ruin. But their laughter stayed behind, carved into the walls, echoing through the empty streets whenever the wind blew. The air itself seemed to remember them. One morning, if morning was the right word, I was found. They came in formation, the last of the Arbites and conscripted workers, faces hidden behind rebreathers, armor dulled to grey by soot. Their boots struck the ground in perfect rhythm, the kind of discipline that only madness sustains. I raised my hands before they even spoke. "Designation?" one demanded. I had no answer. My voice broke in my throat. The Arbite nodded to his comrades. "Salvageable," he said. They bound my wrists and dragged me toward the convoy. They called it redemption through labor. The words had the hollow ring of liturgy, a prayer recited by those who no longer believed. We were the remnants, clerks, deserters, scavengers, all gathered beneath the same rusted banner of obedience. The overseers said we were fortunate, spared by the Emperor to rebuild what we had failed to defend. I laughed when I heard it. The sound earned me a shock baton across the face. I didn't laugh again. Our work was reclamation. We stripped the hive for parts, metal for the forge, bone for the recycler, parchment for the furnaces. Every morning began with the same mechanical benediction blaring from the Vox towers. Work is faith. Waste is heresy. The voice was no longer human. It belonged to a servitor, its tone flat and precise, each word echoing in the empty ruins like a commandment carved into stone. We repeated the phrase until our tongues went numb. The overseers didn't speak to us directly. Orders came through Vox bursts, distorted and distant. We were numbered, not named. My designation was Unit DCXVI 12, Labor Class Reclamation. My old title, Adept 4th Class Logistics Accounting, was erased as cleanly as the hive's skyline. I used to manage supply chains for 1,000 men. Now I sorted scrap from bone with my hands. The irony wasn't lost on me. The days or cycles blurred together. We dug through the ruins of manufactorums, scraping the rust from melted girders, prying machine parts from corpses that had fused to their workstations. Sometimes we found relics, data slates, fragments of purity seals, the occasional half-melted cogitator core. The overseers took those away. Once I found my own office again, or what was left of it. The plaque still read Logistics Accounting, Sector 47B. My desk was there, twisted and blackened. On the side of the drawer, under layers of soot, I found the faint etching of my name. I traced it with my fingers until the skin split. Then I stood and left it behind. At night, we slept in the shadow of the broken spire. Its upper half lay across the ruins like a corpse too vast to bury. The wind howled through its ribs, producing a sound like music if you were desperate enough to imagine it. Sometimes in that hollow song I heard voices, fragments of Binharic prayers, the hum of machines that no longer existed. Other nights I heard laughter again, faint and far away. The orcs were gone, but the echo of their joy still haunted the walls. The overseers called the storm that came next the Emperor's cleansing. We just called it the Green Rain. It fell for 3 days, hissing where it touched metal, burning through cloth and skin alike. Those who tried to take shelter beneath the spire were buried when it shifted, its massive weight crushing entire work crews. The rest of us crawled into the underhive tunnels, breathing air that smelled of copper and rot. I remember one of the workers, a young woman with a rebreather too large for her face, whispering through the static, "Why does he hate us?" No one answered. There are no catechisms for that question. When the storm passed, the hive was quieter than ever. The overseers resumed their routines. The Vox chant began again, work is faith, waste is heresy, but the voice had changed. It stuttered, looped, slurred. The servitor that ran the broadcast was breaking down, its once perfect cadence dissolving into madness. No one repaired it. Maybe no one could. We recited its errors anyway. There was comfort in repetition. Over time, our bodies began to change. Skin hardened from the toxins in the air. Scars turned silver, where metal dust fused into flesh. My left leg broke under falling debris and was replaced with a mechanical brace that hummed when I walked. The overseers called it an augmentation of service. I called it a warning. We were being remade into the machines we served, piece by piece. It was the Emperor's great joke, that even death was a kind of labor. One evening, a transport ship passed overhead, tearing the clouds apart with its engines. We all stopped to watch, our faces tilted upward. For a moment, the light of its thrusters illuminated the ruins, revealing every scar, every broken beam, every piece of a city that refused to die. Someone whispered, "Salvation." But the ship didn't land. It dropped a crate instead, marked with the sigil of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Inside were corpses, hundreds of them, stacked like cargo. The label read biological material. Process immediately. We did. The overseers called it efficiency. I called it prophecy. I no longer prayed. Prayer was arithmetic without result, but sometimes when the workday ended and the vox fell silent, I looked out across the wasteland and felt something close to reverence. Not for the Emperor, not for the Imperium, but for the endurance of ruin itself. The hive still breathed. Its fires still flickered beneath the ash. It refused extinction, and so did I. One night I sat beside the broken spire as a new storm gathered. Lightning flashed green across the horizon, painting the ruins in memory. The air hummed with static and sorrow. I laughed softly, the sound dry and hollow. One of the newer workers, her eyes still too bright, turned to me. "Why do you laugh?" she asked. "Because," I said, "we're the Emperor's joke." She didn't understand. None of them did. Maybe I didn't either. When the rain came, I let it fall on me. The acid stung. The metal in my leg sparked, and I felt something almost like life. The hive whispered in the wind, its voice made of rust and breath and memory. I imagined it saying, "Keep working. Keep living. Keep remembering," so I do. Each day I dig. Each night I write invisible reports in the air, summaries for a bureaucracy that no longer exists. Post-incident evaluation, hive pyrrhithus, status terminal, faith theoretical, remarks, continuation achieved. Sometimes I imagine that centuries from now, another adept will find what remains of this place. Bones, chains, fragments of words carved into rusted walls, and he'll file them under imperial losses acceptable. And maybe, in that moment, the Emperor will finally laugh with me.